prayers tonight. Those that are voiced out loud, those that are said silently. And Father, collectively, we want to come together on behalf of the individuals that we've talked about this evening. And Father, I do pray for Al's son, Sean, living in Palm Harbor with the COVID virus, and I pray for healing for him. And also wanted to pray for Mickey Woodard at Oak Hill, now with pneumonia and infection in the lungs and with COVID as well. I pray for him. I pray that you'll give the doctors their wisdom as to what they can do and need to do for him. And Father, I pray most of all that your hand of healing would be upon him. And Father, as we've found out in the news or by personal experience or rumors we've heard, that the virus is spreading once again. This new variant is spreading rather rapidly, especially in the state of Florida. And so, Father, we pray for those who are struggling right now with COVID, as Dan Atwood as well is trying to recover from that. I just pray, Father, that your hand of healing would be upon all of them. And I pray for Amy as she goes in for the stress test, that you would give the doctors wisdom to figure out what's going on with her. And most of all, Father, I just pray for your hand of healing to be upon her, that you would completely restore her health. And Father, I just want to lift up Lillian Brown's niece, Dee, who had a stroke earlier this week and is now at Seven Rivers. I pray for her. I pray for Lillian and for her family as they are taking care of her. And I just pray, Father, that you'll work out all the details of healing and restoration in the life of Dee. I pray for David Anning, who's just going through one medical struggle after another. I pray for healing for him, and I just pray that you would bless him, and may he know that you're with him every step of the way as he takes this journey. I pray for Ellen Betts. I pray that this surgery was successful. I pray it'll completely restore her back, that the pain will go away and she'll feel strong again. And I just pray that you would bless her. And for Mills and Thela, both going through some rough times with their health, I just pray, Father, that you'll take care of their needs. And Father, I thank you for church members and friends who have been helping them in recent days and helping them get through this really difficult time in their life. I pray for Janice Doherty. I pray for healing for her. I pray they'll figure out the trach and what they need to do. And I just pray that you'll continue to guide her and direct her. I pray that David Glazer's surgery today went well, that he'll be on the mend. And I just pray that you'll bless him and bless Darlene as she's now in a new work situation. And I just pray that you will take care of both of them and meet their needs. I pray for Jackie Hall. I thank you that the surgery was successful. I just pray now for her healing, and I pray that this treatment that she receives would be effective in bringing the cancer, keeping it under control so that it doesn't spread and that it doesn't come back. Father, I pray for Chuck Hoffman and for Annie. Thank you that they've been able to be here the last couple of weeks, and I just pray, especially for Chuck's eyesight, that it would return, that the doctors could figure out what they need to do to help him there. And for Mary Carroll, as she kind of begins life over again in a new place, I just pray that you would bless her. Thank you for taking care of her needs. Thank you for all the church members and family members who have been helping her as well as she seeks to rebuild her life. I pray for Jeanette Standard, that you will keep her going strong now that home health is no longer coming in. For Jeanette Taylor, that the pain will go away and the doctors will find some answers for her. And Father, I just thank you tonight for an opportunity to get together to study your word, to learn, to grow together. And Father, there are others on our list as well. And I just pray that your will and your plan would be accomplished in each of their lives. Father, you are a wonderful heavenly Father. And it is so great that we have an opportunity to pray to you and an opportunity to lift up those who just need a special touch for you. And Father, I just pray that you will meet each of their needs. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Well, tonight we continue in the book of Acts. We're going to look at chapter 25, verses 13 through 27. And since it's been a couple weeks, let me quickly review. This section that we're in, and we're getting close to the end, is Paul's witness before Jews, Gentiles, and kings. In this section, Paul gives speeches. He gives a defense speech before the Jewish people, before a couple of Roman governors, and also, we're going to find out tonight, before King Agrippa II. And this is all prophesied. God told Ananias that Paul would proclaim his name to the Gentiles and their kings and the people of Israel. And we're seeing that verse fulfilled in Paul's life as he gives these speeches. We looked at Paul's witness before the Jews. That's when he was arrested, falsely accused of taking Gentiles into the forbidden area of the temple. They arrested him. He almost lost his life on 4 separate occasions and eventually was transferred to Caesarea, where it was much safer for him to be. We are now in this section, chapters 24 through 26, talking about Paul's witness before Gentiles and the king. And Paul's case was heard again in Caesarea before Governor Felix. And chapter 24 is the almost complete edition of what a Roman trial would look like. And it's very familiar to us because we use some of those same procedures in our law courts today. The prosecution goes first and presents their case. Then the defense has an opportunity to present their case as well. And then finally there's a verdict. Except in this case there was no verdict, there was a delay. Felix did not want to give a verdict, so he simply left Paul in custody until he was removed from office. 3 charges against Paul, and they reappear again and again. He incites riots, but Paul points out that he did not incite the riot in Jerusalem. There was some Jewish people from Ephesus who started the riot. He was minding his own business in the temple area, going through a purification ceremony when he was falsely accused. And because of the false accusations, that stirred up the riot. The second charge is that he leads an illegal religion. The Jews referred to it as the Nazarene sect, meaning it's not Jewish, it's something other than our religion. Paul referred to it as the way. We call it Christianity today. But Paul makes the point that Christianity comes right out of Judaism. That everything about Christianity is in line with his beliefs as a Pharisee. And what the scriptures teach, Jesus fulfilled. And in many ways we would say today that Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. In fact, Jewish people today who are Christians often call themselves a completed Jew or a messianic Jew, meaning they accept Jesus as Messiah, which completes those prophecies in the Old Testament. The Jewish religion is a legal religion under the Roman Empire. And if Christianity comes out of Judaism, Christianity ought to be a legal religion as well. And that's one of the points that Luke wants to make. And then finally, he defiled the temple. He brought non-Jewish people, Gentile people, into the Jewish-only section of the temple. The only problem is the people who accused him of doing that are nowhere to be found. They went back to Ephesus. And Paul makes the point, where are my accusers? You know, if somebody saw me do this, where are they? And of course, they weren't in the courtroom. There were no eyewitnesses to make that point. And so that accusation should be considered null and void. Then there's the trial before Festus. And we looked at that trial last week. This particular trial, as Luke tells the story, is very summarized because we've already had the trial. This is a repeat of the same thing. Felix is no longer the governor. He got removed from office. Festus is now the governor, and he goes through this same process again of giving Paul a trial. The Jewish people bring their accusations, same accusations. Paul gives his defense, same defense. But there's only one thing that's different. Festus wants to do the Jewish people a favor. He's the new governor. He's their governor. He wants to get in on their good side. because his predecessors did not get in on the good side of the Jewish people. And because of that, they ended up losing their jobs. So Festus wants to do the Jewish people a favor. At the same time, he has to protect Paul's rights because Paul is a Roman citizen. So he basically doesn't make a decision either. And we're going to find out tonight, in his heart, he believes that Paul's innocent. In fact, he knows Paul is innocent. But the Jewish people wanted Festus to move the trial from Caesarea back to Jerusalem. And the Jewish people know if they can move Paul back to Jerusalem, Paul will never get out of that city alive. Even if he's declared innocent and set free, he will not get out of that city alive. They've got him at that point. And Festus turns to Paul and says, "Are you willing to go back to Jerusalem for this trial?" And Paul says, "No." He says, "I'm in a Roman court. This is where I should be tried. The decision should be made here." Paul got very nervous, thinking that Festus may want indeed to give the Jews a favor and would move the case. So Paul decides to appeal the case, the trial, to Caesar. It was kind of the trump card of a Roman citizen. If you didn't like the verdict, or if you didn't think you were receiving justice, you could appeal the case. And you could appeal it all the way to the Caesar, the Roman emperor. And that's what Paul decides to do. So Paul's case now must go to Rome. That's the home of the Roman emperor. So now Festus has only one job left. Send Paul to Caesar in Rome and write up a report indicating the charges against him and the fact that Paul has appealed the case to the Caesar. And that's where we left off in verse 12. Tonight we're going to look at a conversation between Festus, the governor, and King Agrippa II. King Agrippa II is part Jewish. He calls himself the King of the Jews. That's his title. He's not completely Jewish. Not all the Jewish people like him or want him to have that title. But he has the title, the King of the Jews. And from the standpoint of Festus, he's looking to fill out a form. The charges against Paul. What are they? And he can't figure them out. Because according to Roman law, Paul's done nothing wrong. Somehow this has something to do with Jewish law and Jewish religion. And Festus doesn't know a thing about Jewish law, and he especially doesn't know anything about Jewish religion. So he's hoping that Agrippa, who comes to visit him, can help him figure this out and fill out the form so he can finally get Paul out of Caesarea, on his way to Rome, and the case can completely wrap up. That's the goal. So this whole conversation is basically there so that Festus can tell the emperor what the charges are against Paul. And we're going to repeat a court case. This particular court case has no legal standing. There's not going to be an outcome. It's really a fishing expedition. It's all to help poor Governor Festus figure out what Paul did wrong so he can fill out the report and send Paul on to the emperor. But Paul takes advantage of this situation. It's a great opportunity as an audience. So what does Paul do? Well, he talks about his conversion to Christianity. He talks about that scene on the road to Damascus again when he encountered Jesus. He makes the point that he was raised Jewish and his new beliefs are also Jewish. And he also will make the point that the risen Jesus has given him a commission to preach the message of salvation, not just to Jewish people, but to Gentile people too. And that's the statement that got him in trouble when he was giving his speech before the Jewish people at the temple. I mean, they put up with Paul when he was talking about Jesus. But when he mentioned the word Gentiles, everybody went berserk. Because the Jewish people at that time didn't like Gentiles and especially didn't like Romans. They wanted their freedom. And because of that, when Paul mentioned Gentiles, everybody goes nuts once again. Why does Luke record this? Well, Luke wants to make the point that Christians are not doing anything illegal under Roman law. Christians aren't forming a rebellion against the Roman Empire. They're not breaking any laws. He also wants to make the point that Christianity stands in continuity with the Jewish religion. Christianity comes right out of Judaism. And since the Romans have recognized Judaism as a legal religion, they should do the same with Christianity. The Romans should simply let the Christians practice their religion freely and not interfere with what they're doing. That's what Luke wants to happen. Well, let's take a look at this conversation between Governor Festus and King Agrippa II. And it's in Acts chapter 25. And I just want to read verses 13 through 22. Then we'll come back and look at them in detail. Beginning with verse 13. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priest and elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar." Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear this man myself." He replied, "Tomorrow you will hear him." An incredible story. And it all begins in verse 13. It says, a few days later, a few days after Paul made the appeal to Caesar, and it was really only about a month after Festus became the governor, that King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea. And they want to pay their respects. They want to honor the new governor. They want to build a positive relationship with this new governor named Festus. We meet somebody named King Agrippa. It's a fascinating story. His name is Marcus Julius Agrippa II. He's the only surviving son of Herod Agrippa I. He's also the great-grandson of Herod the Great, who happened to be in control over Israel when Jesus was born. Herod comes from a family that's not so positive to the Jewish people and not very positive to Christians either. His father, King Herod Agrippa I, his story is told in Acts chapter 12. Agrippa I had James, the brother of John, arrested and eventually executed. And when he saw that it pleased the Jewish people, he has Peter arrested too. He doesn't have time to try him and execute him before a Jewish festival. So he decides to wait until the Jewish festival is over and then bring him forward for trial and eventually execute Peter too. And you have in Acts chapter 12 that amazing story of the church praying for Peter's release. And God sends an angel into the jail, rescues Peter, sends him back to the church, and eventually Peter leaves Jerusalem before anybody can find out that he's escaped from prison. Later in that same chapter, Agrippa I has one of these incredible ceremonies of pomp and circumstance, and the sun is shining on him, and because of his attire, he's glowing. And somebody in the audience says, "This isn't the voice of a person, this is the voice of a God." And Herod did not stop that. He received the compliment instead of correcting it. And the Bible says that God struck him and that he was eaten by worms, which basically most scholars think he developed a disease that eventually killed him. So Agrippa II's father had one Christian martyred and was after Peter as well. His great-grandfather was Herod the Great, who was in charge of the area when Jesus was born. We know his story from the wise men, or the Magi. They come and ask, "Where is the one who's born King of the Jews?" Well, Herod the Great's thinking, "I am the King of the Jews." What do you mean somebody's born King of the Jews? Well, he ends up asking the Jewish scholars, it's Bethlehem. He tells the Magi, "Go there and find the King of the Jews. Then come back and tell me where he lives." Well, an angel warns the Magi not to go back to Herod. And what does Herod do? He has every boy baby, 2 years and younger, slaughtered in order to get rid of the supposed new King of the Jews. What a family to be born into. And Herod Agrippa II was born in about AD 27. He grew up in Rome. In AD 48, he was given his uncle's territory. His uncle dies, and it's the small kingdom of Caucasus that he's now the ruler over. His territory enlarges in AD 53. He's given the former territories of Philip and Lysanias. In AD 56, Nero gives him additional territory around the Sea of Galilee, including Caesarea Philippi. Now, Agrippa II was never over the Jewish people in particular. Most of the people he ruled over were Gentiles. The Jewish people, the nation of Israel itself, was always under the jurisdiction of a governor. At this point, it's Governor Festus. However, the Romans did give Agrippa II custody of the ceremonial garments worn by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. That's when he went into the inner part of the temple that only he could enter, and he could only enter there one day a year on the Day of Atonement. So those special garments somehow ended up in the hands of Agrippa II. Agrippa II was also given the opportunity to appoint the Jewish high priest. The Jewish high priest was recognized as the political and the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. And for that reason, Agrippa II could call himself the King of the Jews, and he enjoyed that title. It's interesting that when Agrippa shows up, he's accompanied by Bernice. Bernice is not his wife. Bernice happens to be his sister. And she has quite the interesting story as well. She's a year younger than Agrippa II. Many scholars have called her a Jewish Cleopatra because of her story. She was married at age 13 to Herod of Caucasus, And when he died, the husband-uncle died in AD 48, and her brother, Agrippa II, was then made ruler of Caucasus, Bernice moved in with him and stayed with him for a number of years. And rumors were rampant, even among the Romans, that they were carrying on an incestuous relationship. But nobody would come out and say too much to them. In AD 63, Bernice decides to marry the king of Cilicia. Many scholars feel just to avert the rumors, because she doesn't stay with him for very long. And in the early 70s, she accompanies her brother, Agrippa II, once again to Rome. Later, Bernice becomes the mistress of General Titus, who was Vespasian's son. Emperor Vespasian was the Roman emperor when the Jewish people rebelled against Rome and declared war on Rome. General Titus was the Roman general, who entered Jerusalem with his troops, burned down the temple, and destroyed the city and the country. And Bernice was connected with all of them. Titus eventually wanted to marry Bernice, but it was socially unacceptable to marry a Jewish person, especially after what had just happened. Eventually, Titus becomes the emperor in about AD 79, and he's forced to abandon his relationship with Bernice. You think you live in a crazy world? Paul did too. The Roman world was incredibly corrupt. All the political and sexual corruption that we think of today, well, it was just as rampant in the Roman world as well. And Paul enters that story. And Paul is about to stand before Agrippa II and Bernice and share his story, share his defense. In verse 14, it says, since Agrippa and Bernice were spending many days there, Festus discusses Paul's case with the king. Festus has to fill out a form, the charges against Paul. He has nothing to write. And here's this king of the Jews who has shown up in his territory, and this is a great opportunity for Agrippa to help him understand Jewish law and Jewish religion, and hopefully fill out the form so that he can move Paul along to Rome and be finished with this particular case. And what we have in verses 14 through 21 is Festus giving his story of what happened with Paul. In other words, verses 14 through 21 is the same story told in chapter 25, verses 1 through 12, but this time from the point of view of Festus. And when you get to tell the story, you get to spin the story in your favor. Remember Lysias, when he had to send Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea? He included a report, and in that report, he made himself look good. Lysias had actually broken some Roman laws. He doesn't mention that. He basically twists the facts so that he comes out smelling like a rose. Festus is going to do the same thing. So he begins by saying, there's a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. True. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. Well, yes, that's what they wanted. The Jewish people wanted Paul dead. There's no doubt about that. But that wasn't their request of the governor. Their request of the governor was to move the case from Caesarea to Jerusalem. That's what they were asking for. But when Festus tells the story, he leaves that part out. The only thing he says is that the Jewish people want him to be condemned. And then in verses 16 and 17, he explains Roman legal procedure, basically making himself come off as this person who is the great defender of Roman civil law. He says, I told them, the Jews, that it's not Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers. Now, what's interesting about this is we have these same laws in our law court. If you accuse somebody of a crime, you have to go to court and face that person and deliver your charges against them. And that's what they practiced back in Roman times. So you couldn't just accuse somebody and let it go. You had to go to court and face the person that you were accusing. And that's what he did. And then the person being accused had the opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. And the Jewish people knew that. The Jewish people weren't looking to, have a phony trial. They didn't care about that. They cared about the location of the trial. Because remember, their initial plan was, if Paul gets moved from Caesarea to Jerusalem, we're going to ambush him along the way, and we're going to kill him. We're not even going to let a trial happen in Jerusalem. We're going to kill him en route. That was their initial plan. So they weren't concerned about justice. They were concerned about the location of the trial. Verse 17 says, when they came here, I did not delay the case. That's true. The next day, he orders the man to be brought in. Beginning with verse 18, Festus makes some honest confessions. The first honest confession is they didn't accuse him or charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Festus was probably thinking, this man's a revolutionary. He's either killing Jewish people or he's killing Roman people. He's a murderer. This is going to be a slam dunk case. They'll bring the charges and I'll order him to be executed. That's not what happened. The Jewish people tried to accuse Paul of treason, but Paul didn't even stir up the riot. And Festus knows enough about Christianity to know there's no movement among Christians to overthrow the Roman government. The accusations, there's nothing to them. They're completely empty. None of the crimes that he had expected. What is the case all about from the perspective of Festus? He says in verse 19, instead they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. This wasn't even a Roman civil case. If this was a Roman civil case, Festus knew what to do. He was highly trained. This is a Jewish religious case. And Festus is going, I have no idea what you're talking about. And it's interesting how he phrases this. There's some points of dispute about their own religion. And the Jewish religion's legal under Roman law, so I can't rule on something that's legal. If you've got a dispute with your religion and you're Jewish, you got to work it out on your own. Because according to Roman law, the Jews can practice their religion. So I can't bring him up on a religious crime if the religion in question is Judaism, because it's legal. And then there's some stuff about a dead guy named Jesus. And Paul says he's alive. It's interesting how little Festus knows about either Judaism or Christianity. And the whole idea of resurrection is a foreign concept to a Roman person. The Romans didn't believe in resurrecting the body. The idea that a resurrection could take place it's not going to happen. And even if it did, it wouldn't do any good. That's not part of their religion. Now, initially, this was a case of Paul bringing Gentile people into the temple. That seems to have disappeared. All of a sudden, this case is about a resurrection. And Paul is the one responsible for turning the case. When Paul was before the Jewish Sanhedrin, Paul said, I'm on trial here because of my belief in the resurrection. And all the Pharisees say, we believe in a resurrection. And all the Sadducees said, we don't believe in a resurrection. And Paul split the court. And from that moment on, this case is all about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claims is alive. That becomes the issue in this case. Then in verse 20, Festus makes the confession, I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. It's like, what do I do with that? So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. Now, Festus basically admits Paul's done nothing wrong. Paul's broken no Roman law. He doesn't even know what to write in the report. So the right thing for him to do, the just thing for him to do, is to declare Paul not guilty and set him free. If you're the judge and you believe that the accused is innocent, you don't ask the accused to move the trial somewhere else. The right thing to do is to set the man free. The right thing to do is to throw the case out of court, because this is not about Roman civil law. This is about Jewish law and Jewish religion. So, if Festus was the great defender of the Roman legal system that he claims to be, he should have set Paul free and thrown the case out of court. That's what Gallio did back in Acts chapter 18, when charges were brought against Christians. He basically said, the Christians have broken no Roman law. This is a dispute among Jewish people. So go settle it yourselves. We're not getting involved. That's what Festus should have done. He admits that Paul is innocent, but he finds himself in a political quandary. He wants to do the Jews a favor, and he wants to protect Paul's rights as a Roman citizen. And he can't find a way to do both. So he's backed himself into a corner, and he has no answer. But luckily for him, Paul gives him a way out in verse 21. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. That's his way out. Paul gives him a way out. All he has to do now is send Paul to Rome with some paperwork about what Paul has done and why Paul has appealed the case. In verse 22, Agrippa says, I would like to hear this man myself. And Festus, you got to give him credit. He's a man of action. Tomorrow, you will hear him. Not next week, not next month. This is going to happen tomorrow. So we move to the next section, which is Paul's speech before Agrippa II. And we're going to look at the setting for that speech. And in many ways, this speech that Paul's going to give before Agrippa is the climax of his defense speeches. He will give the speech before a very dignified and noble Roman audience, and also before a Jewish king. So he will be addressing both Jews and Gentiles in this final defense speech. Now, this particular case, this particular trial that's about to take place, is not a legal trial. King Agrippa II has no legal authority to do anything. So in many ways, this is a mock trial. In many ways, this is a trial that has no bearing on the case. Agrippa cannot make a decision to either convict Paul or to set him free. He doesn't have the authority. Paul has already made his appeal to Caesar, and once you make your appeal to Caesar you shall go. That's the law. So there can be no other trial than the trial before Caesar. So why are we doing this? What's the issue? Poor Festus needs a little help. He has no idea what to write in his report, and he must write a report. And hopefully, King Agrippa II can help him figure out this case. Well, let's look at the setting. We find it in chapter 25, verses 23 through 27. It says, "The next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with their high-ranking officers and the leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, 'King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man? The whole Jewish community has petitioned me against him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him.'" So we have this mock trial, which has no legal bearing whatsoever, but it has a purpose to figure out what Paul did. And it begins with great pomp and circumstance. And if you can imagine this room, and in comes first King Agrippa and Bernice, dressed as king and queen. And oh, the irony. They look so good and proper on the outside. But as one person said, on the inside, they're poor wretches in need of forgiveness. They look great on the outside, but spiritually on the inside, they're pretty rotten, as we've already talked about their life history. Next come the high-ranking officers. These are the tribunes. These are officers in charge of 1,000 soldiers. And probably there are 5 of them, because there are 5 auxiliary cohorts stationed at Caesarea. Next come the nobles, or the leading men of the city, those who have money, power, and influence in Caesarea. And then finally, when the show is over, when the pageantry has ended, Paul is brought in. There's quite a contrast between Agrippa II and Paul. Agrippa enters the room with great pageantry. Paul enters in chains. Military commanders and civil leaders surround King Agrippa II. Paul stands alone. Agrippa carries great human power. Paul carries divine truth. What a contrast. Here's all of these people dressed to the nines with all the pomp and circumstance. And in walks a poor man in chains, the Apostle Paul. If only everyone in that room that day could see into the future and could see how history would remember the people in that room. They would have been shocked. They would have been stunned. Some of them would have been scandalized. King Agrippa II and Bernice, if it wasn't for this story in Acts chapter 25, most people would not even remember who they are. But that man in chains, millions of people have read his writings. Millions of people have read his story. Just about every Christian can quote something Paul said. Nobody can quote what Agrippa II or Bernice may have said. Oh, what a contrast. History remembers Paul. We study him and read his writings almost weekly. Bernice, Agrippa II, well, most of you probably heard their story for the first time tonight. And then there's the evaluation of heaven. Not just history, but heaven. When heaven looks at the life of Paul, Paul's held in great esteem. Paul was able to write honestly right before his execution that I fought a good fight. I finished my race. I kept the faith. And now there is in store for me the crown of life, which the Lord will give to me on that day, the day of his return. Paul is held in high esteem by heaven. Not so much Agrippa II or Bernice or Festus or anyone else in that room. But yet here we are in 2021, and every day we are tempted to live by the standards of earth. We often look at people and look at ourselves according to the standards of earth. Should we not look at ourselves and look at others from the standards of heaven? The standards that last forever. The standards that really count. Yeah, Agrippa II and Bernice lived according to the ways of this world. And yes, at the time they were successful. But as the old metaphor says, they climbed the ladder of success that was leaning against the wrong wall. Paul did not look like a success that day. But history and heaven tell a different story. We should live according to the standards of heaven, not according to the standards of earth. We should do church based upon the standards of heaven, not upon the standards of earth. What a contrast. Festus then said, and Festus is kind of going to give the prosecution part of this case. It's more of an introduction, but since there's no prosecution, Festus will kind of give that case. And again, he's going to spin the case his way. He says the whole Jewish community petitioned him about this guy named Paul. Was it really the whole Jewish community? No. It was the Sanhedrin. But it wasn't even all the Sanhedrin. It was the high priest, the chief priests, and the Sadducees in the Sanhedrin who had the issue against Paul. It wasn't all the people, and it wasn't even all the Sanhedrin. From the standpoint of Festus, the case began when he went to Jerusalem and talked to the Jewish people. And they obviously wanted Paul executed. But that's not really where the case started. The case started when Paul was initially arrested in Jerusalem. And he delivered his speech before the Jewish people. And what was their conclusion in chapter 22? He ought not to live any longer. And here Luke summarizes this whole case, going back to the fact that the Jewish people say of Paul, he's not fit to live. And then this wonderful defender of Roman justice says, I found he had done nothing deserving of death. And the question is, well, why didn't you set him free then? But, well, Festus can't say that. And Festus cannot really say, I'm playing politics. So he blames it